Have you ever felt unseen, caught in circumstances beyond your control, wondering if your struggles matter to anyone? Hagar's story, tucked within the pages of the Bible, speaks directly to those moments. As a servant, a mother, and a woman of resilience, Hagar's life is a powerful testament to God's faithfulness in the face of hardship. From her encounters with Abraham and Sarah to her transformative meetings with God in the wilderness, her journey offers profound lessons about trust, hope, and the unshakable love of our Creator. Hagar's life is a reminder that no one is forgotten by God. Even in moments of despair and uncertainty, His gaze is upon us, and His plans are unfolding. Through her story, we'll uncover how faith can transform pain into purpose and how hope can spring from the most challenging situations. This journey will inspire you to embrace God's promises and recognize His presence, even when life feels overwhelming. Prepare to be moved as we explore the story of Hagar, the servant who became a symbol of hope and purpose. Discover how her life can encourage you to face life's challenges with courage, trust God's timing, and find renewed faith in His unchanging love. Let her journey ignite hope in your heart and remind you that you too are seen and cherished by the one who holds the universe. Hagar's story begins in the shadows, a place where many of us might feel forgotten. She was an Egyptian servant in the household of Abraham and Sarah, chosen not for her influence or power, but for her availability and loyalty. Her position might seem insignificant to some, but it was within these humble beginnings that God prepared her for a destiny she could never have imagined. Have you ever felt unseen in your own life, wondering if your role matters? Take heart. Hagar's story is proof that God often works through the overlooked. As a servant, Hagar's life revolved around the needs of others. She was likely young, obedient, and hard-working, doing her best to fulfill her duties. But being in Abraham's household meant she lived under the promise of God, a promise that shaped not just her future, but the future of nations. Imagine the daily routines she managed, unaware that her life would one day intersect with divine purpose. It's important to remember that Hagar was not in control of her circumstances. Like many of us, she was caught up in decisions made by others, decisions that deeply impacted her life. When Sarah struggled to bear children, it was Hagar who became part of Sarah's plan to fulfill God's promise through human effort. Can you think of a time when someone else's choices drastically altered your path? Hagar's journey reminds us that even in those moments, God's hand is at work. Though her role was to serve, Hagar became part of something much greater when Sarah offered her to Abraham as a wife. It's here that her life shifted dramatically. Suddenly, Hagar carried a weight of expectation she had not asked for. Can you imagine the pressure of being chosen to carry the hope of a family's legacy? Yet even in this, God's plan was unfolding. But Hagar's story wasn't free from strife. Her pregnancy with Ishmael introduced tension into the household, straining her relationship with Sarah. Jealousy and conflict erupted, forcing Hagar into a position of isolation and hardship. Isn't it comforting to know that even biblical figures faced family turmoil and emotional struggles? These moments remind us that God sees us, even in our pain. Through her trials, Hagar likely clung to her daily tasks as a source of stability, much like we hold on to routine when life feels uncertain. Yet her story tells us that God doesn't leave us in the shadows. Even when our roles feel small, they are part of a much larger tapestry that He is weaving. As we step into the next chapter of Hagar's life, we see her beginning to find her voice and her place in God's plan. Hagar's journey, like ours, was not about where she started, but about where God was leading her. What does her humble beginning inspire in your own life? Do you see glimpses of God's hand in your daily walk? Let's continue to follow her story and discover how a servant's path transformed into one of destiny. Abraham's household was no ordinary family. It carried the weight of God's covenant, a divine promise that Abraham would father a great nation. Yet, as the years passed and Sarah remained barren, questions and doubts crept in. Have you ever felt like God's promises for your life were delayed, leaving you wondering if you misunderstood his plan? That's where we find Abraham and Sarah when Hagar becomes part of the story. God's covenant with Abraham was filled with grandeur. He promised descendants as numerous as the stars, a land to call their own, and a legacy that would bless all nations. But this promise seemed impossible when Sarah and Abraham reached old age without a child. How often do we look at our circumstances and think, how can this ever happen? Hagar's involvement was a result of that very question, a human attempt to fulfill God's divine promise. When Sarah suggested that Abraham have a child with Hagar, it wasn't just a personal decision, it was a choice born from deep frustration and a desire to control the uncontrollable. Hagar, as a servant, had no say in this plan, but she found herself thrust into a pivotal role. Isn't it incredible how God can use even the most unexpected people in the most surprising ways? Hagar's pregnancy with Ishmael was a turning point. Suddenly, she carried within her the tangible beginning of God's promise to Abraham. Yet this plan wasn't without complications. The human tendency to take matters into our own hands often leads to friction, as it did between Sarah and Hagar. In our own lives, how often do we rush ahead of God, only to find ourselves in messy situations that test our faith and patience? The tension between Sarah and Hagar reveals a profound truth. Even when we make mistakes or take wrong turns, God's plan remains steadfast. His promises are not dependent on human perfection. Hagar's part in this story wasn't accidental. It was woven into God's plan long before she ever entered Abraham's household. Even though Hagar may have felt like a pawn in someone else's story, God had a unique plan for her and her son. Ishmael would grow to become the father of a great nation, fulfilling part of the promise God made to Abraham. In this, we see God's faithfulness extending beyond human limitations and decisions. Isn't it reassuring to know that even when life feels chaotic, God's promises are unshakable? As we move forward, Hagar's journey becomes more personal. She transitions from being a silent participant in someone else's plan to having her own transformative encounter with God. Her story encourages us to trust that, no matter where we are in life, God's covenant with his people is steadfast, and his plans for us are good. Are you ready to dive deeper into Hagar's story? Let's explore how the conflict in Abraham's household sets the stage for a divine encounter in the wilderness. Hagar's pregnancy brought more than life into Abraham's household. It brought tension, jealousy, and heartache. What should have been a joyous season turned into a battleground of emotions. Sarah, once hopeful that this arrangement would fulfill God's promise, now wrestled with feelings of inadequacy and resentment. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where comparison or unmet expectations clouded your joy? Sarah's struggle reminds us that even the most faithful can face moments of doubt. Hagar, on the other hand, experienced a shift in her identity. As the bearer of Abraham's child, she moved from servanthood to a position of significance. This new role, however, came with its challenges. The tension between Hagar and Sarah began to escalate, creating a hostile environment where peace seemed impossible. It's a reminder of how quickly relationships can unravel when envy and pride take root. The Bible tells us that Hagar began to look down on Sarah, while Sarah retaliated by treating Hagar harshly. This mutual hostility drove a wedge between the two women, leaving the household divided. Have you ever been part of a relationship where misunderstandings or unspoken pain led to conflict? These moments are difficult, but they also present an opportunity for growth and reconciliation. Caught in the middle, Abraham faced the unenviable task of navigating this conflict. When Sarah demanded that he take action, he allowed her to deal with Hagar as she saw fit. This decision led to even harsher treatment, forcing Hagar to flee into the wilderness. Sometimes when faced with conflict, it feels easier to escape than to address the underlying issues. Hagar's flight was not just a physical journey, but a spiritual one as well. The wilderness often symbolizes a place of emptiness and despair, but it is also where God meets his people. In her moment of desperation, Hagar encountered the angel of the Lord, who comforted her and gave her hope for the future. It's a powerful reminder that God sees us in our pain, even when others fail to. Hagar's experience with conflict teaches us several lessons: the importance of humility, the dangers of jealousy, and the need to trust God's timing. But more than that, it reveals a God who intervenes in our lives, bringing peace and purpose where there was once chaos. Are there relationships in your life that need healing? Hagar's story encourages us to bring our struggles to God, trusting that he can turn even the most painful situations into something beautiful. As Hagar returns to the household under God's guidance, her story shifts from conflict to connection. The wilderness encounter sets the stage for her to recognize El Roi, the God who sees her. Let's explore this transformative moment in the next chapter. If this message touched your heart, share in the comments how faith has helped you navigate conflicts in your own life. Or simply comment the word vision to let us know you're on this journey with us. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring biblical stories. The wilderness can be a place of despair, where isolation and hopelessness take hold. For Hagar, fleeing from Sarah's harsh treatment brought her to such a place, a barren desert with no clear path forward. Can you recall a moment in your life when you felt utterly lost, unsure of where to turn? In those moments, God often meets us in ways we never expect, just as he did for Hagar. Alone and vulnerable, Hagar encountered the angel of the Lord, a moment that changed everything. The angel called her by name, saying, "Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?" It's striking that the first recorded question from the angel wasn't about her circumstances, but her journey. Isn't it comforting to know that God cares not just about where we are, but about the direction of our hearts and lives? This encounter was deeply personal. God knew Hagar's name, her pain, and her struggles. He instructed her to return to Sarah and submit to her authority, but not without a promise of hope. The angel revealed that her son, Ishmael, would be the father of a great nation. How often do we need that reminder in our own wilderness experiences, that even when the path seems harsh, God's promises remain steadfast? Through this encounter, Hagar gave God a name, El Roi, meaning the God who sees me. In a world where she likely felt invisible and insignificant, this name declared the truth of God's intimate knowledge of her heart and her struggles. Have you ever felt truly seen by God, even when others overlooked you? This moment in Hagar's story reminds us that God sees every tear, every fear, and every step we take. The wilderness became a sacred space for Hagar, a place where God's presence turned her despair into hope. It's a powerful reminder that no matter how desolate our surroundings may seem, God can transform them into places of encounter and renewal. Hagar left the wilderness not as a victim, but as a woman strengthened by divine assurance. Returning to Abraham's household must have been daunting, yet Hagar carried with her a new sense of purpose and trust in God's plan. Her obedience in returning shows us that faith sometimes requires us to walk back into difficult situations, armed with the knowledge that God goes before us. As we move into the next chapter of Hagar's story, we see the fulfillment of God's promise to her through the birth of Ishmael. Her wilderness experience sets the tone for a life marked by resilience and trust in the God who sees. Are you ready to continue this journey and uncover the legacy of her son? In the barren wilderness, Hagar encountered a side of God that forever changed her understanding of his nature. She called him El Roi, meaning the God who sees me. This wasn't just a declaration, it was a revelation. Hagar, a servant, a foreigner, and a woman in distress, realized she was not invisible to God. Have you ever felt unseen, as though your struggles didn't matter? Hagar's story reassures us that God sees us fully, our pain, our fears, and our potential. When Hagar named God, she claimed a truth that many of us need to hear. God's gaze is not distant or indifferent. He sees us intimately and compassionately. This acknowledgement gave Hagar the courage to return to a challenging situation, knowing she was not abandoned. Imagine the strength it must have taken to go back to Abraham's household, facing Sarah's hostility, yet armed with the assurance of being seen by God. Hagar pressed forward. How would your life change if you walked each day knowing God's eyes are on you? The name El Roi reveals more than just God's awareness. It highlights his active care. Hagar wasn't merely observed, she was comforted, guided, and given a promise. In our own lives, this truth means that God isn't a passive spectator, but a loving Father who steps into our stories with purpose. When we feel lost in the wilderness, we can trust that God's gaze brings hope and direction. Hagar's recognition of El Roi also reminds us of the value God places on each individual. At a time when society might have dismissed Hagar's worth, God's attention affirmed her significance. For those of us who've faced moments of feeling overlooked or undervalued, this is a powerful reminder of our worth in God's eyes. Have you taken a moment recently to reflect on how deeply loved and valued you are by Him? This divine encounter also carries a challenge: to see others as God sees them. Just as Hagar experienced the transformative power of being seen, we are called to extend that same grace to those around us. Who in your life might be longing to feel seen and valued? A kind word, a listening ear, or a simple act of kindness can reflect God's love in profound ways. As Hagar returned to Abraham's household, she carried the weight of a promise and the assurance of God's presence. Her journey teaches us that being seen by God doesn't mean the absence of hardship, but the presence of hope and strength. The God who saw Hagar sees us today in every moment of struggle and triumph. In the next chapter, we'll see how God's promise to Hagar unfolds through the birth of Ishmael, a child destined to shape the course of history. Let's continue exploring how God's faithfulness transforms lives, even in the most unexpected ways. The birth of Ishmael marked the beginning of a new chapter in Hagar's life, one filled with both hope and complexity. Ishmael wasn't just any child, he was a living testament to God's promise to Hagar. Imagine the emotions she must have felt as she held her son for the first time, knowing that God had not only seen her, but also blessed her with a legacy. Have you ever felt that your life was part of something greater than you could comprehend? Ishmael's story reminds us that God's plans often stretch far beyond our understanding. From the moment of his conception, Ishmael's life carried divine significance. God promised Hagar that her son would be the father of a great nation, a blessing that underscored his importance in the grand narrative of faith. Yet, his destiny also came with challenges. The angel of the Lord foretold that Ishmael would live a life of conflict, a wild donkey of a man whose hand would be against others and theirs against him. It's a sobering reminder that even blessings can come with trials, and God's plans often unfold in ways we don't expect. As Ishmael grew, his presence brought joy and tension to Abraham's household. For Hagar, he was a source of pride, a tangible reminder of God's faithfulness. For Sarah, however, Ishmael represented a complicated reality. He was both a fulfillment of her plan and a constant reminder of her own barrenness. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where blessings for one person felt like challenges for another? This dynamic between Sarah, Hagar, and Ishmael reflects the human tendency to wrestle with God's timing and purpose. Despite the tension, Ishmael's role in the story of faith is undeniable. As Abraham's firstborn son, he held a unique place in history. Though not the child through whom God's covenant with Abraham would be fulfilled, Ishmael was still a recipient of God's promises. This duality highlights an important truth. Every life has value and purpose in God's plan, even when it doesn't align with human expectations. Hagar's role as Ishmael's mother was pivotal. She nurtured him, guided him, and likely reminded him of the promises spoken over his life. It's a beautiful example of how faith can be passed down through generations. Parents and guardians today can draw inspiration from Hagar, trusting that the seeds of faith they plant in their children's hearts will bear fruit in God's time. As Ishmael grew older, his presence continued to shape the household dynamic, leading to eventual separation. Yet even in the moments of division and difficulty, God remained faithful to his promise to Hagar and Ishmael. The story reminds us that God's blessings are not contingent on perfect circumstances. They are rooted in his unchanging character. In the next chapter, we'll follow Hagar and Ishmael into the desert once again, where their faith and resilience are tested. Let's see how God's provision sustains them in one of their darkest moments. The desert is a place of testing, a harsh, unyielding environment that challenges every ounce of strength and faith. For Hagar, her second journey into the wilderness with Ishmael was one of the most profound trials of her life. After being sent away from Abraham's household, she wandered with her son, carrying the weight of uncertainty. Can you imagine her fear as their water supply dwindled and survival seemed impossible? Yet even in the bleakest moments, Hagar's story reminds us that God's provision is unwavering. As their journey grew desperate, Hagar placed Ishmael under a bush, unable to bear watching him die of thirst. It's a moment of raw human vulnerability, one that many of us can relate to when we feel helpless in the face of overwhelming challenges. In her anguish, Hagar lifted her voice and wept, a cry that echoed her deep sorrow. But in that moment, God heard her, and he responded. Isn't it comforting to know that our tears and cries never go unnoticed by the one who loves us? God's intervention came through an angel who reassured Hagar, saying, "Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there." This divine encounter reminded her that Ishmael's life was part of a greater plan. The angel directed her to a well of water, a miraculous provision in the midst of her despair. Have you experienced moments in your life when God provided exactly what you needed, just when you thought all hope was lost? This turning point in Hagar's story illustrates a profound truth. God is not just a distant observer, he is an active provider. The well in the wilderness symbolized his ability to meet not only physical needs, but also emotional and spiritual ones. Hagar's faith was renewed, and she found the strength to continue her journey, knowing that God's promises would sustain her and her son. Ishmael, too, grew in resilience through this experience. The wilderness became a place of preparation, shaping him into the strong and independent man he was destined to be. His story serves as a reminder that hardships, while difficult, can be transformative. How often do we look back on our own struggles and see how they shaped us into who we are today? Hagar's resilience in the desert is an inspiring example of unwavering trust in God's provision. Her story challenges us to hold on to faith even when the path seems impossible. It's in those moments of surrender that we often discover God's power and grace at work in our lives. As we move forward, the legacy of Ishmael takes center stage. His journey, shaped by the faith and strength of his mother, leads to the fulfillment of God's promise to Hagar. Let's explore the impact of this legacy and what it means for us today. Hagar's story is one of resilience and divine promise, but it is also a story of legacy. A legacy born not in palaces or prosperity, but in the harsh wilderness. Ishmael, the son of Hagar, grew up to become the father of a great nation, fulfilling God's promise to her. Can you imagine the pride and awe Hagar must have felt, knowing that her son's future was secured by God himself? Her journey teaches us that God can bring greatness from even the most difficult beginnings. The Bible tells us that Ishmael became a skilled archer, living in the wilderness and thriving in an environment that initially seemed hostile. This growth wasn't by accident. It was the fulfillment of God's plan for him to become the father of 12 princes and a great nation. Isn't it amazing how God uses challenging circumstances to prepare us for his purposes? The desert that tested Ishmael's endurance became the foundation of his strength. Hagar's role in this legacy cannot be overstated. As a mother, she instilled in Ishmael the faith and resilience she herself had learned through her encounters with God. She likely reminded him of the promise spoken over his life, giving him the courage to face the unknown. Parents and mentors today can draw from Hagar's example, trusting that their guidance and prayers can shape the next generation for God's glory. The legacy of Ishmael is a testament to God's faithfulness. Despite being sent away from Abraham's household, Ishmael was never outside the scope of God's plan. His descendants became a vast and influential people, fulfilling the angel's prophecy to Hagar. This reminds us that God's promises are not limited by human circumstances. Have you ever seen God work in unexpected ways to bring his plans to fruition? While Ishmael's legacy is significant, it also highlights the complexity of God's promises. Ishmael's descendants and Isaac's descendants would later have their own challenges and conflicts, reflecting the human struggle to live in harmony. Yet through it all, God's purposes remained steadfast. This duality teaches us that while life may not always be simple, God's overarching plan is always good. Hagar's story encourages us to consider our own legacies. What are we leaving behind for those who come after us? Whether it's faith, perseverance, or kindness, the seeds we plant today can grow into something far greater than we imagine. Hagar's journey from servanthood to the matriarch of a great nation reminds us that our contributions matter, no matter how humble they may seem. As we reflect on Hagar's legacy, her story moves us to consider the broader lessons it offers. In the next chapter, we'll delve into the spiritual truths her life teaches us about trusting God's plan, even in the midst of uncertainty. Let's uncover the timeless wisdom her journey holds. Hagar's journey is rich with lessons that resonate deeply with those navigating uncertainty, pain, or waiting for God's promises to unfold. Her life, marked by hardship and divine encounters, reminds us that God's plan often becomes clearest in our most challenging moments. Have you ever struggled to trust God's timing or questioned his purposes for your life? Hagar's story encourages us to hold fast to faith even when the path ahead is unclear. One of the most profound lessons from Hagar's life is the importance of surrendering control. When she fled into the wilderness, consumed by fear and despair, it was God who met her and provided clarity. This teaches us that in moments when we feel powerless, surrendering to God can open the door to his provision and guidance. What areas of your life might you need to release into God's hands today? Hagar also demonstrates the power of perseverance. From enduring conflict with Sarah to surviving in the harsh wilderness, her resilience shines as a testament to her faith and strength. Yet, this perseverance wasn't born of sheer willpower. It was sustained by God's promises. When life feels overwhelming, how can you draw strength from the promises in his word, just as Hagar did? Another key lesson is the value of recognizing God's presence in our lives. Hagar's declaration of God as El Roi, the God who sees, reminds us that we are never invisible to him. Even in moments of loneliness or struggle, God's gaze is upon us, offering comfort and assurance. How might your perspective shift if you truly embrace the truth that God sees and cares for every detail of your life? Hagar's story also teaches us about the impact of obedience. When God directed her to return to Sarah, it required humility and trust. Her obedience set the stage for Ishmael's birth and the fulfillment of God's promises. Obedience often requires courage, but it is through this act of faith that we align ourselves with God's greater plan. Are there areas where God might be calling you to step out in obedience, even when it feels difficult? Moreover, Hagar's life reminds us that God is faithful even when we feel forgotten. Her transformation from a servant to the matriarch of a great nation shows that no one is beyond the scope of God's love and purpose. In times of doubt, it's worth asking, what if God is working behind the scenes in ways you cannot yet see? Finally, Hagar's journey invites us to trust God's timing. The blessings promised to her didn't unfold immediately, yet they came to pass exactly as God intended. In our own seasons of waiting, we can find hope in the knowledge that God's timing is perfect, even when it doesn't align with our own expectations. As we prepare to conclude Hagar's story, her life points us toward hope, a hope that anchors us in the promises of God. In the final chapter, let's reflect on how her journey of faith and resilience can inspire us to find strength and purpose in our own lives. Hagar's story is one of hope, rising from the ashes of hardship. From her humble beginnings as a servant to her transformative encounters with God, her life teaches us that hope is not found in perfect circumstances, but in the unwavering faithfulness of God. Have you ever faced a moment when life felt too heavy to bear, yet somehow hope emerged? Hagar's journey reminds us that God meets us in those moments, offering strength for today and hope for tomorrow. One of the most striking aspects of Hagar's story is how God repeatedly sought her out. In the wilderness, when she felt abandoned and unseen, God appeared, not only addressing her immediate needs, but also reminding her of her value and purpose. This shows us that hope is rooted in the truth that we are never alone. God is always with us, guiding and sustaining us. How would your life change if you fully embraced the reality of His constant presence? Hagar also exemplifies the strength that comes from trusting in God's promises. The angel's words assured her that Ishmael's life had a divine purpose, giving her the courage to persevere. Similarly, God's promises to us are a source of hope, reminding us that no matter how uncertain the present may seem, the future is held securely in His hands. What promises from God's word bring you hope during difficult times? Another key lesson is that hope often requires action. Hagar didn't stay in despair. She responded to God's guidance by returning to Sarah and later by caring for Ishmael in the wilderness. Her story encourages us to take steps of faith even when the outcome is unclear. In what areas of your life might God be calling you to act in faith and trust Him with the results? Hagar's resilience also teaches us that hope can thrive even in the harshest environments. The wilderness, a symbol of desolation, became the place where God's provision and promises shone brightest. For many of us, life's wilderness seasons, be they financial struggles, broken relationships, or health challenges, can feel overwhelming. Yet, as Hagar discovered, these are often the spaces where God's power and love are revealed most profoundly. Finally, Hagar's story reminds us that hope is not just for ourselves, but for those we impact. Ishmael's legacy, as the father of a great nation, stands as a testament to the generational impact of Hagar's faith and perseverance. Our own acts of faith and hope can ripple through our families and communities, inspiring others to trust in God's faithfulness. As we close Hagar's story, her life invites us to reflect on our own journeys. Where do you see God's hand at work, even in the midst of hardship? What steps can you take to nurture hope in your life and the lives of those around you? Hagar's story assures us that no matter our past or present struggles, God's promises are sure, His presence is constant, and His hope is unshakable. Hagar's life is a story of transformation, resilience, and divine purpose. From her humble beginnings as a servant to her role as the matriarch of a great nation, her journey reveals the power of God's faithfulness and grace. Her encounters with El Roi remind us that we are never alone. God sees us, knows us, and walks with us through every season of life. Through Hagar's trials, we learn the importance of surrendering control, trusting God's timing, and persevering in faith. Her story encourages us to find hope in hardship, knowing that even in our darkest moments, God is working behind the scenes for our good. Just as he provided for Hagar and Ishmael in the wilderness, he promises to sustain and guide us through life's challenges. As you reflect on Hagar's story, may you be inspired to trust God more deeply and to embrace the truth that his plans for you are good, even when they unfold in unexpected ways. Let her journey remind you that no one is beyond the reach of God's love and that his promises remain steadfast, no matter the circumstances. Let us close with a prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for the story of Hagar, which shows us your unwavering love and provision. Help us to trust you in every season, to find hope in your promises, and to walk forward with faith. May we always remember that we are seen and loved by you. Amen. If this message resonated with you, share it with friends and family who may need encouragement today. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring biblical stories and teachings. Together, let's continue this journey of faith and hope.